believe what you did to me. Who is involved? Who actually conducted this female gender mutilation to me? My mom was like, what? What are you talking about? She was like, I have no idea what that even is. And so that began my idea of what the world sees as Muslim women and what my family sees, what people from different countries see about what a Muslim woman is. So the other question I have for you guys now is, when you think of Muslims and Muslim women, what are some of the things that you hear? You might not necessarily think this, but what are some things you hear about Muslims and Muslim women and Muslim men? Anybody?
They're oppressed.
Okay. Anybody else?
Always covered up.
Okay. Anything else about Muslim women? Don't be shy.
Waiting.
They don't have voices.
Okay.
Men control them.
Okay.
They're third-class citizens.
Okay. Honor killings?
They're not allowed to drive.
Okay. Anything else?
This is not allowed to walk around alone.
I'm sorry?
They're not allowed to walk around alone.
Okay.
Children who live with their children and their husbands.
I'm sorry?
Like they're less with their children.
Okay. So my family, like it was said in my bio, we're third generation Muslims. And so we grew up here. So when I was asked what does it mean to be a Muslim, I couldn't separate that from being a New Yorker. I couldn't separate that from being South Asian. My grandfather's brother was a part of the history of the United States. He actually fought in World War II. He was actually in Germany fighting the Nazis. Our family helped build New York City. We were part of what is now known as Curry Row in the Lower East Side in New York City. And for me growing up, being Muslim was a beautiful thing. You know, I grew up having people talk about Malcolm X, talking about the Nation of Islam. In hip hop, people said Assalamu alaikum, walking down the street. My mom wears a hijab, so walking down the street, people actually say Assalamu alaikum, sister, regardless of where they were from. So all that changed drastically after 9/11. How many of you were in New York City during 9/11? Okay. So 9/11 was a really difficult time, not just for this country, but for New Yorkers. And every single one of us had no choice but to experience it. Whether we were at work, whether we were at school, we were able to see it. Most of us were able to see it from our windows. And most of us lost a family member or friend. I lost a coworker that day, and I lost a high school classmate. But also, there were plenty of Muslims that died that day, and that doesn't get talked about. Plenty of Muslim first responders were there. And what also happened as a result of that day is the unprecedented attacks against Muslims. My father was a New York City taxi driver, and shortly after 9/11, he has a beard, which makes him look Muslim. So shortly after 9/11, he was driving his taxi cab, and someone pulled his beard and told him, go back to your country. Even though, again, my family's been here 3 generations, someone told him to go back to his country. My mom was scared to leave the house. Everyone I know has been discriminated against after 9/11, every Muslim that I know. And at that time, I was working with an organization that was doing social justice, human rights work in the South Asian Muslim community. And what we saw were unprecedented attacks. And it wasn't just spitting, hitting, I mean, people were killed. My father, again, he's a taxi driver. At that time, he had a partner who worked at nighttime, and my dad worked in the daytime. The man is still in a coma. He was attacked that night when he went to work, and he never came back home. And he's still in the hospital. So 9/11 just completely changed our lives. In Brooklyn, there was a huge Pakistani community. And shortly after 9/11, about 45,000 of them were either deported or left the country. And it was literally because the community was targeted by the FBI, by individuals just calling. Let's just say, I didn't like him. And I wanted to say, you know what? I'm gonna get Qasim in trouble. I literally just need to make a phone call and say, I suspect he's a terrorist. It was just that simple. And just like that, half of the Pakistani community in Midwood, Brooklyn disappeared. So as you guys know, what was mentioned earlier is I do work in the community with Muslim women. And so that's what I saw was the amount of violence committed against Muslim women by non-Muslims. And as a result of 9/11. So what happened, so in that Brooklyn community, all of a sudden all these men were gone and women were left to be breadwinners. And so many of them were forced to leave the country, and their kids that grew up here had to leave the country and move to countries that they weren't even familiar with. Now recently, most of you are familiar with the anti-mosque stuff that's been going on. Are any of you familiar with Park 51 in New York City? I'm sure almost everybody is, right? So for a while, many Muslims in my community, in my family, started to feel safe again. My mom started to feel like she could go outside by herself again. But recently, after the recent anti-Muslim hysteria with the mosque, things just got worse. And if you ask the average Muslim, it got worse than it was after 9/11. Ahmed Sharif, a New York City taxi driver, was attacked for being a Muslim. A man asked him while he was driving his cab, "Are you a Muslim?" And the man, who's been living in this country 25 years, has 4 American-born children, was stabbed. He was stabbed in his throat, he stabbed across his face for saying that he was a Muslim. That week, a couple of days later, in a mosque in my neighborhood in Astoria, Queens, where I grew up, a man walked in, and it was during the month of Ramadan. So during the month of Ramadan, in the evening, we break our fast, and then we go to the mosque to pray. So it was in the evening when the mosque was crowded, and this man came in and started peeing all over the prayer rugs. And these are just 2 examples that I'm familiar with because they're from my communities, but incidents like this started increasing all across the country. Mosques were attacked. There was a bonfire outside of the Tennessee Mosque. And there have been multiple protests against mosques everywhere. And again, for women, it got that much worse. A friend of mine who lives here, who's an amazing person, a lawyer, she grew up in the US. She was scared to go out because she wears a hijab. All she would do is go to school and go back home. And she's still scared to go out by herself. And a lot of women also had to change how their I'm sorry. I didn't expect such a big crowd, so I'm a little nervous. So a lot of women really had to change their relationship to the hijab because, I'm sure during the Q&A people are going to ask me about the hijab because that gets asked everywhere. A lot of people had to change their relationship to that. So women that I know that wore hijabs for years actually recently started taking them off. And one of my friends who got her degree in medical lab technician in New York City couldn't find a job forever. The minute she took off her hijab, she found a job. And so people talk about Muslim women's oppression, and that's a longer discussion that I'll get into in the Q&A, but on the flip side of it, Muslim women's oppression isn't just what happens at home when she's with a Muslim man, it's also what happens in the street, when she's experiencing violence, when she's going to work, when she's trying to get a job, when she's trying to go to mosque, when she's trying to take her kids to school. And so some solutions I have to Islamophobia is twofold. Supporting the Muslim community is a number of things, but one of it is just getting to know us. How many of you have friends that are Muslim? Okay. So there was a study that found that when a Muslim is in your circle of friends, you actually don't necessarily perceive Muslims as terrorists. You have a better understanding of Muslims, and you can actually, I'll just leave it at that. And the thing is, speaking up against Islamophobia, just like what's been happening with all the recent bullying across the country with homophobia, it's really difficult because when you're around a group of people that are saying negative things, it's really difficult. But I ask all of you to do that. There was a recent, I would say like a test, that this news program did. And what they did was they had this Muslim woman walk into a grocery store, and this man would pretend that he was being Islamophobic. And so he would say things like, "Get out of here, you shouldn't be in this country." And what they were doing was testing how people would react. And so I don't know how many of you saw this, but of all those people, 6 people were actually saying, "Good job." They were going like this. They were saying, "You're doing a good job in speaking against this woman. She doesn't belong here. She shouldn't be in this country." And the woman's like, "I grew up here. I don't know what you're talking about," but she happened to be wearing a hijab. So then the other 12 actually stuck out for her. And some of them they have friends that are Muslim, and so they were like, this is wrong. We know Muslims, and you shouldn't be doing this. But the vast majority, 22 of them, did not say anything. And that's my fear, that the vast majority of us, we don't say anything. And if you look at our history, the history of the United States, any change that we made, anything that was done, was through people speaking up, was through people fighting for our rights. Right now, the majority of us in this room are benefiting from the civil rights movement. And so I ask all of you to just be involved in creating change and supporting Muslims. And supporting Muslims means giving us the opportunity to be in leadership, to help create a society that actually isn't Islamophobic, and not defining who Muslim women are. I think everyone's quick to say that Muslim women is oppressed, but ask us. Ask us what we think about being a Muslim woman. Ask us what oppression means for us, because it doesn't necessarily mean being forced to wear a hijab. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to hear next from Dr. Koblawi.
Good evening. I remember this is the second time I come to Barry University. The first time when I got accepted on soccer scholarship, and that was in 1996. I just couldn't afford the rest of the tuition, so I decided. And we heard my fellow speaker talking about the issues of the Muslims in America and Islamophobia. That's the title of this gathering or panel. Remember when I was treating a patient just 6-7 months ago, and I wear my mask, as you all know when you go to the dentist, and a lot of you don't because you're scared. And it was when at the time of the election. So I said, "Oh, who are you going to vote for?" He said, "Bush." I said, "For what reason?" He said, "Let him bomb all these Muslims." And of course I'm wearing the mask and everything is covered. So when I was done with him, I took off my mask. And I said, actually before when he said, I said, "Why?" He said, "Because they're all terrorists." So when we finished, I took off the mask. And I said, "You sure?" He said, "Not all of them, most of them." I said, "Most of them." I said, "Okay." That is a problem that has taken place in perhaps the most civilized nation on earth. And we can argue that. But anyway, the problem that we focus on, I believe, as a Muslim, and perhaps my tone will be different than the tone of many speakers you've heard about who talk about Islam, is Islamophobia is a symptom. It's not a disease. And the problem we have in Western medicine these days is they try to treat the symptoms. They don't try to go down to the disease. That's why you find doctors treating the same patient for years. And they're only treating the symptoms. Just like the doctor who, when he retired and his son took over after he studied medicine. And the first patient he sees, he recognized and diagnosed the problem very easily. So he goes to his dad and he said, "Dad, why did you keep this patient for 10 years, treating him for the same thing?" He said, "Son, he sent you to college. He paid for your college. This patient paid for your college. To keep bringing him back and back for the same thing, he paid for his college." And Islamophobia is not any different. We try to talk and discuss Islamophobia, and we are discussing the symptoms, and we forget about the disease. American, I came to the United States in '95, as they mentioned, and I've been living here. And one of the things they want me to talk about is the difference between living in the United States as a Muslim before 9/11 and after 9/11. Me personally, I don't see any difference. I don't see any difference. There was Islamophobia before September 11. There is Islamophobia after September 11, and it will continue. Why? Because we're always talking about the symptom. If we look down and diagnose the problem, the disease itself, then we will understand. And if you know about the situation that took place a few weeks ago in Gainesville, the burning of the Quran, this is how it starts. When you want to destroy people, you burn their books first. And that's what Europe have done throughout their history. That's what they've done to the Jews before they burned them in Nazi Germany. And Muslims are against that. That's what they've done to the Muslims, Ferdinand and Isabella in the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition. They burned the books and the libraries before they killed them. And that's what they did in Sarajevo and for the Bosnians. The very first 2 buildings they burned, one of them was the library, the National Library. That is the attitude. Because the mentality is we don't know how to coexist. They don't know how to tolerate. And I can't sit here and I don't have the time to tell you about the tolerance that Muslims had with the Jews and with the Christians throughout history. But when Muslims were in power. Why? Because they ruled according to the Word of God. And you can see a Jewish writer, a Hebrew university professor, who writes, there was never better symbiosis between Jews and Muslims than the one existed in Muslim Spain. In Muslim Spain. And there is no reason for me to come and tell you how good my religion is. You have your religion and I have my religion. I'm convinced that my religion is the best religion. You convinced your religion is the best religion, that's why you insist to follow. I'm not going to tell you, I accept everything in your religion because I will be contradicting mine, and you cannot tell me the same. But at the same time, we can coexist, and we can live together. And there are models throughout history that prove this point. Why hundreds of years ago they were able to coexist, but today we can, and we are the most civilized, and we have the technology, and we have the iPhones, and we have all these things. Really. Because the problem, I believe, and as I said, I've been in this country for about 15, 16 years. I think Americans are nice people. And I think this melting pot, this country, brings people from all over the world. I tell you, personally, I became more attached to my religion since I came to the United States. Not to say the environment was not there back home, but wherever you live, when everyone is the same, you take it for granted. So I always say I owe it to this country for being a better Muslim. And I say it with full mouth and with full pride. I'm Muslim, and I hope to die as a Muslim. Because I believe my religion is not a religion of terrorists. And I believe my religion is not a religion that oppresses women. Actually, you talk about women in the Middle Ages, in the 1400, when 1400 years ago, when Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, came to say women can inherit, women can choose their husbands, women can have rights, women this, women that. In church, in Europe, they were discussing if women were half devil or half a human being. That's Muslim. That is Islam. Women in Arabia before Muhammad ﷺ, they were buried alive. Girls, when they had girls, they'll bury them alive, fearing poverty and fearing shame. Muhammad came to change all that. Actually, his daughter is called his mother. His own daughter is called his mother because of the way she used to treat him. The mother of Muhammad, even though his real mother died when he was 6. Muslim honor women. Women are our wives and our mothers and our granddaughters and our sisters. So how is it that we oppress them? But the problem is that for the majority of people is they want to juxtapose their lifestyle on everyone else. Yani the West is taking a lifestyle, a model, and they want to go to a Muslim countries, wherever it is, or non-Muslim, but it seems it's obvious that the concern is about Muslims for years. And read Nixon books, that they take that model and they want to juxtapose it on the Muslim world. Why? Aren't we people that we have our own freedom of choice? We choose to be Muslims. Why do you want to change? And excuse me when I use the word just habitual. It means I mean. I just did not get Americanized yet with that. So I'm still stuck with that. The point is, there is a group, that advisory group to the government called the RAND. I'm sure you're familiar with that, the RAND. And there is a report, Civil Democratic Islam, by Cheryl Bernard. She goes in this report categorizing Muslims, I think to 7 or 9 categorization of Muslims. Fundamentalist, radical fundamentalist, secularist, this, modern, and every category has its own specifications and its own things. But if you look just at the title, that says Civil Democratic Islam. The point of the paper is how we can change Islam. How we can change Muslims, put them in a category or in one of those, and of course she recommends at the end that it should be at the level of keep them nice people, but keep them passive. They want a new passive Muslim society, that you do whatever you want and let it happen, let them stay quiet. We as Muslims do not believe in the principle, turn the other cheek. We believe in forgiveness. We believe in forbearance when you have the power. When you can, but when you realize being forgiven and forbearing will make the oppressor even worse and more oppressive, we don't turn the other cheek. Maybe other nations will, but Muslims will not. Muslims will look and say, what is the problem? Muslims say Islamophobia. They don't just turn the other cheek, just hate me as much as I personally don't care. I personally, and maybe this is surprising, I don't care what people think of me as long as I believe I'm doing the right thing. As long as I'm not doing something wrong. When I start doing something wrong, then that's when I worry about what people think. But majority of people choose not to know. And they blame ignorance. I don't believe that. I think this is idiotic and this is funny. That people are Islamophobic because they're ignorant. They're not ignorant. Ignorant is not to know or to know little of something. But those people are determined, they made a decision. I'm going to be Islamophobic. Why he made that decision? Why he's not Buddha phobic or Buddhism phobic or Hindu phobic, or this or that religion phobic? He's Islam phobic because the sources of information that is or he's using tells him be Islamophobic. When you have people like Bernard Lewis, and you have people like Cheryl Bernard, and you have people like Daniel Pipes, and you have organizations like those people that advise the government what to do, that's a problem. That is a problem. And that is the disease. The disease is people who are lawmakers. As I said, I believe American people are nice. And very nice, simple people. Most of them. Just like every other kind of people. But I feel a lot of them are so naive. They have turned into sponge. That they're going to absorb whatever they're being told. And that is the problem. And if you look at those who control the media, and those who control the newspapers and the magazines, that is the goal. And you cannot stay in business if you choose to say other than that. You cannot stay in business if you choose to say other than that. And that is the reality. That's what we need to tackle. That is, you are the educated people. And I believe those who go to universities in America are the elite. Forget about the elite with the money and with the power. Those have dead hearts. Those don't care. As long as I'm making more money and my bank account is going higher and higher and I'm selling more weapons, I don't care if there is 1,000 Iraqis dying a month. And I don't care if a whole nation is being destroyed in Afghanistan, a whole civilization. Or Pakistan, people in weddings and celebrations are being bombed every day. For what? They talk about Muslims being the terrorists in the World War I, in this century, the last 100 years. More than 150 million people are dead. How many of those Muslims have killed? If we're going to talk about numbers. But the reality is there is a deeper, more rooted problem. And that is the West cannot coexist. The West, when the West sees there is a threat, the only way is to exterminate it and destroy it. And that is what we see. And that is why what Muslims feel. an defense advisory board to the Pentagon came in their report in 2004, November report, and you can go back to it. They said Muslims don't hate American freedom. Muslims hate American policies. American policies. There are Americans who hate American policies.
Here, here.
Hallelujah. So that is what we believe. And you guys are studying, you are educated, and you will be making a difference. And that is what needs to be tackled. And knowledge is very important, and it's a key success. And go try one day to live in a Muslim country and see the hospitality you see. You've never seen something like that. But in Islam always called to preserve people's rights. Non-Muslims lived amongst the Muslims. There are 4 types of non-Muslims. In Islam, there are 4 types of non-Muslims. 3 of them, the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, whoever harm one of them, I will denounce him on the day of judgment. 3 of the 4 of the non-Muslims. Every Muslim, every non-Muslim who has treaty or who has covenant or who has a promise of protection by Muslims, by any Muslim, is not to be touched. The fourth type of non-Muslims is the combative non-Muslim. And there is no one in the world can tell a Muslim, do not fight back. If someone attacking me, I don't have the right to defend. If anyone believes that way, then tell me your address so I can come to your house and take whatever I want from home, from your house. Because the reality and the human nature indicates this is the fact. You have women like Ayan Ali, what's the middle name? Hersey. This is a woman who claims that she was oppressed as a Muslim woman. She fled Somalia, and then she went to the Netherlands. Somehow, an immigrant. Few years, she becomes in the Dutch Parliament, and she even lied on her citizenship application. She comes to the United States. All her writings and books is telling people to leave Islam and how bad Islam is and how bad. That is not the issue. This is not the issue. Salman Rushdie did it before, and he became a hero. Salman Rushdie was honored by the Queen of England recently. Why? Because he writes against Islam. This woman takes a job, and very lucrative job in one of those organizations. I don't know the name. Then another Manji, right? Yeah. This is another one who writes against Islam and all that. Gets the award from Oprah Winfrey. Oprah Winfrey gives him, and the director get a job. The director of Courage Project at NYU. The only reason is they talk about Islam. They're against Islam. So the issue, Islamophobia, the problem is not ignorance. The problem is the knowledge that you have. Sometimes knowledge is harmful. When it's wrong knowledge. When it's a biased knowledge. When it's a knowledge intended to harm people. And I believe, as our Prophet, peace be upon him, told us, and this is what we believe in the Hadith, authentic narration, that the Messenger of Islam said that people are about to gather all together against you. And he's talking to the Muslims. And this is what's happening. They talk about Muslim terrorists. What's happening in Palestine? No one is talking about it. The Israeli machine is being supported and funded by the United States. Why no one is talking about it? Why this country is supporting every totalitarian regime in the Middle East? They support Egypt, and they support Jordan, and they support all these dictators. Why? Why you care about? What does tell me from all this, that you're supporting the Muslims, or you want to help the Muslims? Muslims don't want that help. Muslims want the bottom line. Muslims want the West to leave them alone. To leave them alone. That is the bottom line. If you have something good, bring it on, we will share it. Because we shared with you a lot of goods. Go read the history and learn about geometry and learn about the zero. The zero. There's nothing today works without zeros. Check out who invented it. Check out algebra. Check about algorithm. Check. We already did a lot. Muslims are at fault as well. And I finish with this. Muslims are at fault because they're not representing their religion the way it's supposed to be. The way it's, this religion bring happiness to mankind, and it did bring. It did bring. Just like it was said when the Muslims reached Turkey today, what's called Turkey today, it was said by a Christian person, right? He said that the turban of the Turk is better than the tiara of the Pope. So it's only 15 minutes, and I'm sorry, but there's nothing much better.
Thank you, Dr. Koblawi. And next we're going to hear from Muhammad Malik.
So we heard some really interesting perspectives, both from Nilu as a Muslim American and also from Brother Al-Fadi. And I'm going to kind of give a perspective that's going to dig deeper into why in the media and all the imagery that we see in American society, we're sort of inundated by all these negative imagery of Muslims, almost to the point where it's almost as if someone who isn't exposed to a Muslim personally has almost no choice but to believe what these negative images are telling them. But before I do that, I want to kind of talk about a couple of things that Brother Fadi had mentioned. A lot of the discussion about Muslims and are they inherently violent? Are they trying to destroy America? A lot of these kind of exaggerated claims, I think, come from a conflation of conflicts that are happening abroad, and unfortunately that conflation of the Muslim identity with the conflicts that are happening abroad in some Muslim countries or in some areas where there's a majority of Muslims or a prominent minority community. That conflation, I think, is a distortion of reality and also doesn't really explain both the reality of the Muslims who are living abroad and also of the Muslims who are living here in the United States. So what I'm going to do is kind of just back up a little bit and talk about Islamophobia in context, and also talk about some of these troubling views and some of these troubling psychological and sociological dimensions that we should consider when we think about why Muslims are so demonized in American media. First of all, like Brother Fadi and like Neela was saying, Islamophobia is something that didn't just arise from a vacuum, and it's not something that just came from 9/11. There was Islamophobia before. There was Islamophobia at 9/11, and we're going to continue to see it, as Brother Fadi said. But there also is Islamophobia in Europe, and there's also Islamophobia where there's a prominent Muslim minority in different countries abroad. So with that said, I'm just going to talk about it. I'm going to mention a couple of troubling viewpoints, stereotypes, misconceptions that I've kind of identified when I was looking at this. The first contention, the first misconception that I often find is that folks believe that Islam is monolithic. And what do we mean by monolithic? We mean that there's only one representation of Islam. My name is Muhammad and I have a beard. This is Islam. The notion that there's only one understanding of what it means to be a Muslim, the notion that there is this one stereotypical, unidimensional understanding of what it means to be a Muslim. A Muslim woman, she wears a hijab. There's some women who don't wear hijab. So a monolithic understanding of Islam is something that is a part of the problem, is part of what I would consider root cause. And the other factors that I'm going to go through are some of the other root causes that I've identified. Second, there's this understanding that, this misguided understanding that Islam is static, that it's neither influenced nor does it influence. As Brother Fadi mentioned, there's algebra. It comes from the Arabic root of the word. There's many contributions in Islamic architecture. There's various, the numerical system that we use, the Arabic numerals. Clearly there has been an influence of Islamic culture on all cultures. But also, conversely, there also has been an influence on Muslim societies and on Islam of other sort of factors, societal and religious factors. So I think it's important to also see Islam as something that's not simply static, but as something that, like every other entity, changes and has various expressions depending upon the culture and the historical context. One of the other troubling dimensions that we see in media depictions or just in general conversations about Islam is this notion of the other, or this concept of us versus them. And some of the sort of adjectives that we'll see oftentimes spouted in describing Muslim as the other are words like barbaric, irrational, primitive, and sexist. These are just a couple of adjectives I was thinking as I was preparing to come here earlier today. And we think about that, again, this kind of notion that the Muslim other is barbaric, irrational, primitive, and sexist reminds us of something that's happened historically during colonization. You see, in order for the colonists to colonize people, whether it was indigenous people, whether it was enslaving blacks, whether it was subjugating any kind of person, if you look throughout history, you couldn't subjugate that person or that people if you loved them, if you thought they were rational, if you thought they were civilized, if you thought that they were advanced. So you demonize them and you subjugate them. And that creates a justification for exploiting them and for discriminating. So it's important to also understand that what we see in Islamophobia is something that's happened to blacks and Latinos struggling throughout this country to get their rights. It's also something that's happened before we talk about African Americans and Latinos. During the time of the 1600s and 1500s, different people of color around the world were subjugated, but they had to be demonized first. So that's also another consideration I think we need to think about. We need to put all this in historical context and understand that what has happened to Muslims is something that happened historically to other folks. Another concept, notion, understanding, is that Muslims are somehow inherently violent. Almost as if we have some violence gene in us that activates us upon conception to throw a bomb or to hit someone or commit any kind of, any variety of violent action. This is absolutely false. And the notion of this usually comes from when, you talk about people like Robert Spencer, Daniel Pipes. Again, unfortunately, these are people who, some of whom I've actually advised the FBI and other notable entities on government policy. Their notion was that, some of these authors' notion was that if you look at Islam, Islam is inherently violent. That to be a good Muslim means that you have to be violent. It means you have to commit an atrocity. Almost as if Islam is a human rights atrocity machine, in a way. And of course, that's completely false. And of course, that also brings us to this another misconception. The idea that Islam is not a religion. The idea that Islam is some sort of tyrannical, radical cult. Or that Islam is, simply put, some sort of political ideology. And that, of course, is also misguided. So, these are just 5 notions that I want to briefly go through to give some context to the personal experiences that Nilu was discussing and also some of the discussion that Brother Fabi mentioned. And one of the last things that I noticed was that there's a notion in Europe and also in the United States that Islam is, and this is amongst a lot of right-wing, reactionary sort of, I guess you'd call them thinkers, like Pam Geller and Robert Spencer and Daniel Pipes, and the list can go on and on. This notion that Islam is taking over our world. This notion that we are trying to subvert the Constitution of the United States with Sharia law. We replace the Constitution with Islamic law. There's all these sort of notions that we saw a lot of mainstream America foisting onto Italian Americans by calling them WAPs, or foisting onto Mexicans by saying they're taking over our country, they're invading. So Muslims, especially immigrants who are recent immigrants, and we're not recent immigrants. I mean, Muslim community, again, it begins with Africans being brought as slaves. If you didn't know, a third of the Muslim community in the United States, a third of African slaves who were brought to the United States were actually, a third of these, the slaves that were brought to the United, a third of the slaves that were brought to the United States were actually of African descent, who were part of the slaves, and you can see that in roots. But in any case, this notion of they're coming, they're taking over our country, we need to stop them, this is exemplified all throughout history, and this Islamophobic sort of pushback is the most recent pushback that we're seeing. And we see that also in the context of immigration when it comes to Latinos as well. So ultimately, all these different kinds of factors, Islam is monolithic. All these misguided notions that Islam is monolithic, it's static. Muslims are the other, they're barbaric, they're irrational, they're primitive, they're sexist, they're inherently violent, they have a radical, violent political ideology, they're invading our country and taking it over. All these ludicrous ideas subconsciously are what justify discriminating Muslims and also cut away at forming an empathy toward Muslims. So I was also trying to think about a couple of things. Like, for example, a lot of people are here because they probably have watched the news recently and they saw this thing about the guy trying to burn a Quran in Florida. They were reading about the quote-unquote Ram Zero Masjid, or more properly called Park 51 Center. And there's a couple of things that I noticed, some trends. So in the future, if you see any of these kind of social conditions, don't be surprised if you see Islamophobia creeping right around the corner. In times of economic crisis, in times where there's debates about immigration and what it means to be an American, what is it to be an American, in situations where the United States is involved with conflicts abroad, such as Palestine, Iraq, Afghanistan, when that's on the news, and during political cycles, like right now, that's when you're going to see an increase in Islamophobia. So right now, it seems like, we have a political cycle. We're in the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. We have people trying to pass racist laws in Florida now, trying to copycat Arizona, trying to pass SB 1070-like law here, if you guys are not aware of that. So it seems like it's almost like a perfect storm, where you would see this Islamophobic reaction against Muslims across the United States. But this doesn't all happen out of coincidence. It's something that happens within a historical context and within a social context. So I want to lay out some of those things, and end by talking about the political campaigns, because that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing a lot of politicians unprincipably either avoiding the issue of defending Muslims and their equal rights, or outright just bashing Muslims. And why are we seeing that? We're seeing that because in elections that are very close, in which there's Democrats and Republicans fighting for that 1/3 of Americans who vote, unfortunately only 1/3 of Americans vote, so the pie is really small. So during these very heated political cycles, where these big issues are at stake, immigration, should we kick all the immigrants out? Should we keep them and respect them? Economy, should we respect workers? Or should we throw all of our respect to businesses and say the hell with the worker? When all these debates are happening, all these conflicting opinions are cycling around society and all the debate shows, there's Muslims and there's vulnerable communities. And not just Muslims, but Latinos, African Americans, working people, who all should expect an increase in marginalization. So we have to keep that in mind. Is 2010, is what's happening right now, unique? It's not. If you go to 2006, for example, when the political cycle was raging, and again, that's when Democrats were creeping, were fighting to get in control, which they ultimately did and succeeded. Prior to that, there was a huge campaign, an Islamophobic campaign, in which, in key swing states, in states which pollsters identified can go either Republican or Democrat, coincidentally, this propagandistic, Islamophobic, racist film called Obsession was sent out in mass mailings to key districts where people weren't sure. Is this going to be a Republican victory or a Democratic victory? All of a sudden, if you live in that district, you get this Islamophobic video which shows Muslims being violent and crazy in your mailbox. Is that a coincidence? Absolutely not. Because all this is designed to further certain interests. And in this case, the interest is to win. So if you're a political candidate right now, will you defend Muslims and say, I believe in the Constitution, they have equal rights, I will take a hit for my Muslim brother, in the spirit of Martin Luther King? Probably not, because the elections are close. And we should all pay very, very close attention to that. So I just wanted to kind of flesh out some of the things that folks were saying and give it some context. That when you see Islamophobia, what are the social factors that contribute toward that, toward the increase of it, the spikes of it, and also, I'm going to kind of segue and talk about things that we can do. First, what we just did right now is I just identified some root causes, both in the psychological and sociological underpinnings of Islamophobia, but also in the spikes and increases of Islamophobia. So now the question is, okay, we've identified the root causes, or we've diagnosed the problem. We know where the roots are. How do we root this out? First, I think that we need to seriously engage. That means Muslims, Christians, Jews, atheists, gays, lesbians, I don't care what your difference is or what your background is. We need to have absolutely more engagement, both at Barry University and Miami-Dade County and wherever our community is. But not necessarily just any kind of engagement, not necessarily just close conversations or sharing, coffee. But we need to actually do things together. Like I said, this stuff that Muslims are going through is stuff that Latinos, it's stuff that blacks have gone through historically. So this is a moment where we can unite and work on things in common cause. If it's true that that racism and Islamophobia increases during periods of economic crisis, let's work together as Muslim, Christians, and Jews to protect workers. If it's true that whenever we're in a historical moment in which we're trying to figure out what does it mean to be an American, does being an American mean that you need to have a document that means that you're an American? We have this whole immigration discussion. These are the kind of moments where we can show solidarity as all people and fight for human rights together, no matter whose rights they are. And I think that more than just having interfaith dialogue, we all need to really take seriously the legacy of the civil rights and get real. We need to really start fighting for social justice. And that means everyone's rights, not just Muslims' rights. So I just want to end with that note, and also kind of mention, just before I end, this whole notion of conflicts abroad. Because a lot of the misconceptions about Muslims come from what's happening in Palestine. Why are Muslims and Jews fighting like in some sort of inevitable death match to the end, where one of them will just die like a zero-sum game? Why are Muslims and Christians fighting forever? Have they always been fighting forever? There are all these sort of notions that unfortunately are still in the community. So I want to put some of these things into context. Like Brother Fadi was saying, there are conflicts abroad, and the majority of Americans are against them, against the war in Iraq, against Afghanistan, and there's conflicts between people who happen to be Muslim, like for example Palestinians, who by the way are also Christian, and Jesus was a Palestinian. So just to put that also into another context. We need to understand that these are conflicts that are happening abroad. And when we think about what does it mean as an American to relate to Muslims when this is our only exposure, we need to understand again that there's people who are fighting for liberation. There's people who are fighting for freedom. And we have to really make a distinction between a freedom fighter and someone who's a terrorist. Someone who's a terrorist is someone who targets indiscriminately innocents and has absolutely no regard for whether the person he's targeting or the area he's targeting will include civilian casualties. But if a tank rolls down your street and you fight back, are you a terrorist? Or are you trying to protect your mother from being shot in the face? So these are kind of considerations that we need to decontextualize. We live in a very privileged Western society. We don't deal with tanks rolling down our streets. We don't deal with bombs being blasted. We don't deal with troops walking around, going into our houses and randomly searching us. So we have to understand that there's realities that other people are dealing with. And if they choose to resist, then they're doing what you would probably do if Canadian troops were to roll through your streets with tanks, defile and rape, and do all these sort of things. We really need to understand this as an issue of intelligence and not as an issue of violence. Again, there's some people who choose a violent path, there's people who choose a non-violent path. But we have to understand all of that in context and also understand how that comports with international law. So with that, I just want to end with, at the end, a couple of us will be by the door. And if you really want to get involved, and you really think that this is a moment in which we should unite and actually work on some of these issues that unfortunately a lot of politicians are dividing us on, then please stop by. You'll see myself and someone else. We'll be taking email addresses. If you want to actually, we're going to do something right before Thanksgiving, work with the homeless, share meals with the homeless, and also talk about poverty, talk about issues as a group of folks who come from different backgrounds, and talk about how we can seriously deal with issues that should be uniting us rather than dividing us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mohammed. And our final panelist is Captain Rashid.
بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Promise the rest of my discourse will be in English. What I basically said was in the name of God, the gracious and merciful, may the peace and blessings of God be upon you. I want to echo the sentiments. Thank you everybody for coming. It really is a pleasure and an honor to speak for you today. Again, my thanks go out to Danny and Professor for putting this thing together. This is actually my first time in Florida ever. And my wife, we're about to celebrate 3 years of our marriage next month, and she's been begging me to, let's go to Florida, let's go to Florida. And my excuse has been, we can't afford it. And so when I told her I got invited to come down there, she gave me that look, like, really? Where are you going to get money from? That look you women give, It's all right through me, but the wonderful woman that she is, she supported me. Historically speaking, whenever communities have engaged in dialogue to resolve differences, they found to be profoundly successful. And ultimately, it was when that dialogue broke down or when people refused to work together that led to violence and led to things that unfortunately have darkened much of our history. And this is, from an Islamic perspective, such a clear example of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. When he laid claim to prophethood, he sent out letters to all the kings and emperors of his time and let them know that I am that prophet foretold in the Holy Bible. I am that prophet that you've been waiting for. And he invited people to come and have a discourse with him. It wasn't a threat of war or violence or anything of that regard. It was simply come and have a discourse. And in fact, one particular occasion, the Christians of Najran sent a delegation to come meet with him. And they came and they met with him for several days. And in that discussion, he noticed one day that it seemed a bit uncomfortable, it seemed a bit peculiar. So he asked them, is something wrong? Did I say something to offend you? What's the matter? We can resolve this issue. And they said, well, today is our day of worship. It's Sunday. And we need to find a church to go offer our prayer services. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, responded, this mosque, my mosque, is a house of worship. And by all means, offer your prayer services here, which they did. This was also the example when the Muslims, after facing vehement persecution, migrated to Abyssinia to find protection under who? A Christian king. And despite efforts of the pagans of that time to create mischief between the Muslims and the Christians, the Christian king recognized that these were people focused on peace and pluralism and offered them his protection. And history to this day testifies that that empire, because that was the manner in which it interacted with other nations, that empire withstood the onslaught of other empires throughout the years. And this theme lives on today. I'm a member of the Amphib Muslim community. We're the oldest Muslim American organization in America. We were established in 1920 here in America. But since our inception in 1889, the founder of our community, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, who laid claim to be the long-awaited Messiah, championed an intellectual jihad of the pen. He condemned violence in every form. And mind you, this was at a time when the British ruled India, and it was a popular thing to wage jihad against the Christian overlords. And for making this claim that Islam gives you no permission to fight back against a country that has given you freedom of religion, he was branded a heretic. And so I emphasize this for a very important reason. And that is that there are Muslim groups that have existed for well over a century that have condemned violence in every form. This isn't just some post-9/11 bandwagon that we're talking about. This is something that has existed for time and time and time again. In fact, if we get a chance to put it up, I want to show a website that we've launched called MuslimsForPeace.org. This is an international campaign we're launching to demonstrate that, in fact, Islam does stand for peace. So why do I bring this up? What does this have to do with Islamophobia in America? Well, I alluded to it already, that ultimately this comes down to demonstrating that not only is there a need for more communication, but Muslims too can take control over their own future. Muslims must take responsibility on a grander scale. And I think this is something that my colleagues have alluded to earlier as well. It simply isn't fair just to blame the media. It's not fair to blame others. Ultimately, it comes down to recognizing that you control your own image and that you can make a change in your image. Now, this may seem difficult. At a time when America is involved with 2 wars with predominantly Muslim nations, which some can currently label as a war against Islam, I'm sorry, what Americans engaged in 2 wars. It's difficult when the approval ratings for Muslims have plummeted to 30%, which is lower, significantly lower than what they were after 9/11. Events like Fort Hood and failed Times Square bombing definitely don't add any kind of benefit to this. In fact, it only adds more confusion. But yet, there are fewer nations in the world where it is better to be a Muslim than America. It may sound kind of strange, but there really are. This is a fact. When you consider what's going on in Europe right now, Switzerland last November, by nearly 60% of a vote, decided to ban minarets on mosques. This last summer, in the Netherlands, the Anti-Islam Freedom Party, led by Geert Wilders, who is a vehement anti-Islam politician, won 23 seats. And Wilders, if you don't know, has publicly demanded that the Quran be banned, and has actually said that Muslim women who wear headscarves or the hijab be taxed. Imagine for a moment, you walk down the street and because of your article of clothing, you're taxed. Last week, the French Parliament, by a majority vote of 336 to 1, passed a resolution to ban the veil for any reason whatsoever. And this week, the French High Court accepted it as a constitutional ban. But going beyond this, when you look at some Muslim countries like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, persecution of Muslim minorities and religious minorities in general is atrocious. I'm going to discuss that in just a minute. But you compare this to the leadership of our nation. U.S. President Barack Obama, in his speech last year to the Muslim world in Cairo, said, I quote, "Freedom in America is indivisible from the freedom to practice one's religion." That is why there is a mosque in every state in our union and over 1,200 mosques within our borders. That is why the U.S. government has gone to court to protect the right of women and girls to wear the hijab and to punish those who deny that right. And this really goes back to the First Amendment of our Constitution. The Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, taken together, these two clauses safeguard religious liberty and protect religious beliefs in a manner that few other countries in the world have really done. And when you consider that our Constitution has existed for over 200 years, if any of you get a chance, take a constitutional law class. Our current Constitution is one of the longest running constitutions in the world. It is definitely something to be proud of. And in fact, herein lies a practical solution to fight not just Islamophobia, but any kind of hatred or bigotry, whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's racism, whether it's sexism, you name it. First, we look at education, communication, and community service. And I'm going to speak from the perspective of the Ahmadi Muslim community, but the Muslim community is at large as well. One thing that our community does is, you see the Muslims for Peace website, is we host regular Muslims for Peace conferences all over the world. And these conferences are open to Muslims and non-Muslims alike. And typically in America, it's hosted every June, and we get anywhere from 6,000 to 12,000 people attending these from all over the country. How many of you have heard about this before? One person? 2 people? This demonstrates what we're talking about here, that this is not something that makes headline news, unfortunately. Unfortunately. But they are existing, they are going on. This is right here within our own country. We also host something called the Religious Founders Day. Now, this is one of my most favorite events. This is an event where we invite a speaker from a Christian background, a Jewish background, a Buddhist background, even an atheist. And we tackle an issue such as how do we fight poverty? How do we establish peace? How do we champion women's rights? How do we champion equality? And each speaker presents from their own scripture, from their own thoughts, from their own religious guidance, how we can achieve these things. Now, what ultimately ends up happening is people realize that, hey, wait a minute. We may differ in dogma, we may differ in which God we pray to, but ultimately, we have the same common goal of serving our fellow man and improving the society around us. And that's really what it comes down to, guys. That is ultimately what it comes down to. The young children especially are impacted by this because now they're raised in an environment where pluralism is promoted. The old saying goes that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And this is the third element, community service. We engage in countless blood drives, food drives, adopt a highway cleanup, and you're looking at an expert panel who are committed to serving the community around them. And I really hope many of you meet with these guys afterwards to set up and participate in these food drives. But the question still remains, how do we know it's going to work in the face of opposition? How do we know? Well, this brings me to the second aspect, that this is a tried and true method. Even in the face of extreme persecution, when you educate, when you communicate, and when you serve your fellow man through community service, it works. And the best example I can give is Pakistan. I was raised in America, but I was born in Pakistan. Part of the reason why my family in particular migrated to the United States is because as a member of the Ahmadi Muslim community, Pakistan has passed actual constitutional amendments making it illegal for me to call myself a Muslim. The short Arabic prayer that I recited at the beginning of my speech, if I were to say that in Pakistan, I could be arrested, fined, and even be given capital punishment simply for saying that prayer. It's considered blasphemous. Now, in this type of environment, we are forbidden from holding these kind of events. But that does not forbid us from community service. That does not forbid us from helping our fellow men. When the earthquake struck in 2005, the members of the Ahmadi Muslim community in Pakistan activated countless teams to go and help anyone and everyone afflicted. During the recent flood, we did the same thing. And this happens time and time and time and time again. On May 28th, for example, 86 members of the Ahmadi Muslim community were killed in cold blood in Lahore. Many of you may have heard about this on the news. It was a devastating event for many of us. I lost 2 family members myself. But what's significant about this, the reason why I'm sharing this with you is because despite that, our focus was to respond with peace and with pluralism and with prayer and with patience. And again, it's not an easy thing, but it's an effective thing. And this brings me to my last point, that we're not innovators of this. I'm not going to raise a flag and say, look at us, we're the ones who came up with this concept. This goes back to the holy founder of Islam, the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. This is the example that he set forth for all Muslims for all time. If you get a chance, read a biography on his life. There have been several that have been written by non-Muslims. Read a biography. And what you'll find is that when he made his claim to prophethood for 12 years, he and his fellow Muslims suffered the most brutal persecution. There's Islamophobia in America right now, that's fine. But this is nothing compared to what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, went through. Everything from boycotts to beatings to being dragged through the streets, being laid down in the hot sand and having hot stones rolled across his chest, his disciples' chest. And his response throughout the entire time was peace, was patience. Not even so much as a street protest, because that's what Islam forbids, any kind of violence or anything that could lead to violence. And after 12 long years of persecution, he and his disciples migrated some 240 miles away. Now, I want you to consider this is a month-long journey. This isn't something that we can even imagine. Because now, even if you want to go to China, it's a ticket and a 24-hour flight. But imagine after facing brutal persecution simply because of your religious beliefs, you get up and move a month away. Only after they were pursued to be killed, only at that point in time did the Holy Quran, did God give Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his followers permission to defend themselves. And the verses that you commonly see cited about kill them where you find them, kill the Jews or kill the Christians, these verses were under the pretense that you had already endured the persecution, you had left, you had moved away out of that land, out of that nation, and when you were pursued at that point in time, this is when the Quran says that if God did not raise some men to protect others, then surely the churches and the cloisters and the synagogues and the mosques, all where the name of God is often remembered, would have been pulled down. So the idea isn't to promote Islam or to require Islam to be dominant. The idea is to require freedom of conscience and freedom of speech. And that is ultimately the purpose of Islam. And this brings me back to the original point where we started this discussion. And that is that as long as we keep the positive lines of dialogue and communication open, as long as we keep this interaction, this ability to exchange ideas fluid, then we have a chance at success. The fact is that America and Islam share a remarkably similar approach to religious freedom. It is an approach grounded in absolute freedom of conscience and of belief, the free exercise of religion and faith for all people, and most importantly, freedom from state control of religion and mutual respect and cooperation. My brother mentioned this fear of Sharia law, that Sharia law is coming, it's going to come and get you. Almost like, I feel like some monster in the closet about ready to get me. But, when you read the Quran, you find it says very clearly, La ikraha fi din. There is no compulsion in matters of religion. So whatever Sharia law these people are talking about fearing, it certainly isn't Islam, because Islam rejects any notion of compulsion in religion. I want to conclude with the words of the Khalifa of Islam, the worldwide head of the Ahmadi Muslim community, who said on the occasion of opening the Bayt al-Fatu Mosque in London, this is the largest mosque in Western Europe, he said, quote, "A true Muslim can never raise his voice in hatred against his fellow citizens, nor for that matter against the ruling authority or government of the time. It is the responsibility of a true Muslim that he should remain loyal and fully abide by the laws of the land of which he is a subject." And so, my dear friends, what I implore is that at a time when there is much confusion, at a time when there is much misunderstanding, recognize that the true champions of Islam are those who are responding with the pen, those who are responding with sound arguments, those who are responding with sound logic. Because ultimately, if there is any truth in Islam, it should easily be presented with logic. Look, I don't need to convince you that 2 + 2 is 4. It should be pretty obvious to you. And if it's not, well, then we can agree to disagree on something like that. But that's ultimately where it comes down to with Islam. That's why Islam says there's no compulsion in religion. Because it's a message that's designed to appeal to the heart, and it shouldn't require compulsion. And if you agree to disagree, that's fine too. But anytime we stop that discourse, stop that communication, that's when we need to stop and say, hold on a second. Am I stopping this discourse because of my own concern, or am I stopping the discourse because the other person has stopped it? If the other person has stopped it, there's not much you can do about it. But if you feel like stopping yourself, pause for a second and reach out to a Muslim who is willing to engage with you, and I assure you that your concerns will be answered. I encourage you guys to visit this website, muslimsforpeace.org. It's also got a great number to call, 1-800-YISLAM. And again, thank you for your time today.
Thank all 4 of our panelists so far on the first part of this, and the second part involves you, the audience. First of all, does anybody have any questions for any of the panelists? Anything directed, towards one specifically, or in general? Any questions? I mean, we have 4 people who are here willing to talk to us and give us their knowledge. So I already see a hand up right now, but.
Tell them to feel free to ask any kind of question that they think may be controversial, stupid, or crazy.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point, because if we can't talk about those questions here, then we shouldn't even be having this, because if we can't talk about them in a peaceful atmosphere, then they're not needed to be talked about, and the hatred is going to continue. So this should be the place to ask those questions. Go ahead.
Would you stand up and just so we can all hear your question? Or come to the mic if you left.
Oh, excellent. Sorry about that.
I have a question for you, because you opened your speech asking the audience about what their perspective was on Muslim women. And since you work with Muslim women, I wanted to know if the general response of the audience are responses that were generalized in your perspective, or these actual commentary about Muslim women that are true. Because I just wanted a little bit more of your perspective on what it does mean to be a woman in the Muslim faith.
I actually have a question to your question. When you say the commentary, like what specific, just specifically? Because I could go on about that for hours. That's why.
As people responded, people said oppressed, others said dominated men, and just the general response that people gave back. Are these responses that it's something that has come to be because of an American perspective and a lack of knowledge, of true knowledge for the Muslim religion, or are these actualized things that are so uncertain?
No, that's a really good question. So this was mentioned by the brother over here and by me before, that in Islam, men and women are created equal. My mind is a blank right now, but one of the things that I remember often when I speak about this is there's a line in the Quran that talks about men and women being garments for one another. And that one, and the Quran is very similar to other texts where everything is not literal. So from that, people, it talks about equality in marriage, it talks about equality in sexuality. All these topics are touched just from that one line. And so all that to say that women have many rights in Islam. Many Muslim countries, for example, women have the right to vote. And the rights of women is a problem throughout the world. So many times when I'm on panels, I am on panels with people that are recent immigrants. And so a lot of people are able to talk about what happens in other countries. But I could talk about what happens in this country. And in this country, for women, the number one cause of death is domestic violence. Up until 1971, a woman can be raped by her husband and she couldn't go to court. In fact, to this day, a woman cannot go to court in this country and really get support when she says, I'm raped. Forget about being raped by her husband. So some people don't even think that's a concept. When a woman says no, even if it's to her husband, it means no. And so for me, when I think about women, Muslim women, it's part of a bigger discussion of rights that women have in this world. Just a quick thing, when I mentioned women's voting rights. So I'm going to name 4 countries: Syria, Pakistan, Iraq, and Switzerland. Who do you think gave voting rights to women first? Syria. Some people say Syria, some people say Switzerland.
Pakistan.
Okay. Switzerland was the last one, 1971. Syria was the first in 1940. Pakistan was second in 1947, and Iraq was 1948. So, I could go on and on about this, but I'll just leave it there for now.
The women issue is a major issue when it comes to Muslim women. As I said before, unfortunately that the West, or let's say an American woman, sees a Muslim woman, and that is, I'm not talking about you guys, I'm talking about those who have biased opinions and racism, which I consider it, and prejudice. As long as if the Muslim woman doesn't do what the American woman does, then she is oppressed. If a Muslim woman chooses to be covered, she is considered to be coerced to be covered. There's Muslim women, the conversion to Islam in America is the fastest and the highest. And a lot of it, most of it actually, more women than men. More non-Muslim women are coming to Islam and choosing to cover. And they're not even married. And a lot of these women who are covered are not even married. The concept that, as I said, is I'm going to take my cultural background and try to apply it to every type of people in the world. It won't work. Because when a Muslim woman applies her principles to a Westerner woman, then the Western woman is oppressed. A woman to be free doesn't mean that she has or she can walk with a bikini on the beach. For a Muslim woman, she doesn't think like that. A Muslim woman believes to be covered, that's freedom. American woman doesn't think that way. A Muslim woman in Islam, men and women, which you always hear, are equal. But the problem that we are confusing with is we think equality means the same. No, they are equal in their rights and in their obligations. Women are created one way and men are created different way. I hope, and I don't think it will ever come where they say, or they invent a method where a man can be pregnant. Sometimes I work all day long and I come home and I spend a few minutes with my daughter, who's 2.5, and I go crazy. A few minutes before she goes to bed. Her mom with her all day long. And I don't see that frustration that I would feel. So everyone's created different. And everyone, God has given Islam, given them responsibilities that are different than others. She mentioned that rape.
The question is why a woman needs to be raped by her husband. That's a problem. If we're gonna say, I'm a woman, I have my rights, and I'm a man, I have my rights, and you are my wife, and you're gonna sleep with me whenever I want and whenever I feel, or vice versa, then coexistence will not take place. Always in clashes, always problems. That's why divorce rates in the world these days like that, so high, because everyone thinks, you know, I have the power, as they say, I'm the man in that. It doesn't work. You as a woman have responsibilities, and one of those responsibilities, vice versa, as the man, is, for example, she mentioned the issue of intimacy. Well, if I'm gonna say, because I feel like it every time to my husband, I don't feel like sleeping with you, then I'm creating a problem. A woman needs to understand that she might be creating a problem that now the husband has to look outside, or has to go do something else. And vice versa, the husband, the same thing. When his wife tells him, I can't sleep with you today, or I don't want, he has to question why you can. You're sick, fine. You're fine. You're this, but not rape. You see, when we start using words as rape, then we are firing the issue, and we are making it so big. In Islam, the bottom line is, men have duties toward his family, and women have duties toward their family, and vice versa. Are they all the same? They are not the same. They're not the same. God says in the Quran, men have preference over women. But then He does not leave it like that. With what? With what? One of the things is he is responsible about spending on the house, for example. That is why he has that preference with these issues, not because he's smarter, not because he's more advanced. There are certain criteria make the man has preference over the woman, and their criteria, if he fails to do that, then the woman has the preference. So the point is, we have to balance, and we have to understand that each one has his own responsibilities. And I cannot say, I expect my wife to do the same things that I do. I don't expect that, because I can't do the same things she does. All right?
And just to kind of add, just very shortly, you know, in about half an hour or so, I'm going to go home. I'm married, and I'm going to be cooking for my wife. I'm going to be doing the laundry, because she's in graduate school at University of Miami. She does the taxes, and she does the accounting, stuff like that. I work at the ACLU. So again, there's these stereotypes that relationships between men and women are always where the man was a stereotypical male role, or the woman has a stereotypical female role. In reality, relationships are as unique as the individuals who are part of them. So that's also something to understand. But also, in addition to that, I think it's important to understand that what Neela said was absolutely important and very, very critical, that you have to look at women's rights across the world. My cousin, she works for the United Nations Gender Development Program in Pakistan. So for example, where you find poverty, you have a vulnerability. And where you're a woman living in here's a very important word, patriarchal society, and you're poor, and you're a woman, you have additional layers of vulnerability. I don't care what religion you are, and I don't care what society it is. If it's patriarchal and you're poor and you're a woman, there most likely are going to be some barriers to access to education, to health care, and also there may be some stereotypical gender roles. And that comes through education, it comes through societies changing internally on their own over time. So I think it's also very important to understand that there's something called patriarchy, which is really the root problem here that we're talking about. And to the extent that there's people who interpret the Quran or the Torah or the Bible to basically reinforce male dominance, that's the prerogative of the person who is doing the interpretation, and that's merely a reflection of patriarchy. That's something that, if you talk to Muslims, you talk to Jews, you talk to Christians, you'll find patriarchal Christians, you'll find patriarchal Jews and Muslims, and then you'll find those who are a little bit more enlightened about that. So that's all I wanted.
For time restraints, we can only take one more question right now, but I know some of the speakers will still be here afterwards. I know a lot of people have a lot of questions, so actually, let me hear both your questions real quick, just to see right here.
I can start. If it's true about equality, how do you justify the male being able to marry 4 wives but not the vice versa?
These are probably important questions, but we really wanted to keep this focused on the social justice and human rights issues. And I know we've deviated a little, but could we maybe reserve that question to talk individually to some of the panelists about, and focus our time as a big group on something that's about the issue of Islamophobia? I don't mean to diminish your question, but
Social justice is also part of the...
Absolutely, but that gets a little bit more into doctrine than we were hoping to, and I know, again, some people led us that direction, so I don't mean to squash you, sir, but, with sake of time, if we could have another question that's a little bit broader in perspective, and then we can maybe answer that more on an individual capacity, if that's okay. So if anyone has a question, we do have a hand over here. Okay, and I see a couple others, although we've had this hand's been up since the get-go, so I am going to actually call on Pastor out because he was eagerly waiting if he would ask your question. And again, I may use executive decision-making power or something to direct us if it seems like it's a similar kind of question.
I just wanted to ask this question because some of you said about the Muslims being portrayed or interpreted as violent. My question is, because we've heard this in media about jihad, some people get the wrong impression that jihad is war, holy war against non-Muslims and all that. My question is, what is the true meaning of jihad?
So one way of understanding jihad is to understand it as meaning struggle. When you're studying for an exam and you really feel tired, but you're really motivated, you want to become a doctor, you really want to help society, but you need that A on that exam, you're going to be struggling. There's a greater, there's a lesser jihad, right? The lesser jihad is the one you hear about repelling, is the one that you hear in the media, and I think it's in many ways misinterpreted. What I want to kind of mention is the greater jihad. The greater jihad is an internal struggle, the internal struggle that all of us face every single day. Whether it's keeping ourselves healthy, whether it's maintaining our self-control, whether it's being patient and listening to others when we feel like we want to talk. It could come in many different forms. So I think that you can understand it as a struggle, as something that's can be both internal and also external.
It's a very important question. If I could just piggyback on that, I think ultimately in these kind of situations, it's imperative to go back to the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, because he's a model for all Muslims. And my brother, alluded to it, but there's actually a saying, a tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, where upon returning from battle, he said, "We have returned from the lesser jihad to engage in the greater jihad." And it's that continual struggle against the self that incites to evil. It's the continual struggle against complacency. It's the continual struggle against anything that removes you from contributing to society. The lesser jihad, that holy war that we talk about, I mentioned in my discourse that ultimately that's a defense mechanism allowed under very strict criteria. And I alluded to that criteria that first you bear with patience, then you try to change it through legal means, and if all else fails, you leave the area. And once you're pursued, and then basically hunted down to be killed, at that point in time, you're allowed to defend yourself, only to the point that they continue to fight. And even during that fight, you're only allowed to defend yourself against the attacker. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, vehemently restricted attacking any innocent person, any elderly person, even a wounded soldier was off limits. No livestock was to be killed, no houses were to be hurt, no trees were to even be hurt. This was the humanitarian aspect of it. The rules of war that he set forth were phenomenal. And when you study his life and you see the prisoners of war that were taken into captivity, their ransom to be set free was that they were to teach 10 Muslims how to read and write. And if they did teach 10 Muslims how to read and write, that was the ransom they were to be set free. I mean, what a humane aspect. And in fact, history testifies that it was due to this experience that many of the prisoners of war recognized that this is a matter of truth and ultimately accepted Islam through that matter. It goes back to what we talked about, of keeping the lines of discourse and communication open. So I just want to add to that.
And I hate to be the timekeeper, but somehow I've taken on that role. We did promise some people that we would end at 8. I know we're over 8, so I know there are also a lot of questions. A lot of things came up, some of them inspiring and some of them controversial and some of them just informative. but we do have to cut off the questioning as a large group, but you're welcome as long as the panelists are able to stay to approach them and peacefully ask nice questions. We do want to thank you for being here, and please don't leave yet because Danny wanted to say a few last words also. We also have a small gift for each of our panelists. It's a small token of our department's appreciation. We have a Barry University bag for everybody, and I'm going to pass those out. And we're also going to pass out some evaluations, but if you would just let Danny have your attention for just a moment more.
All right. Actually, I asked Dr. Finley if this was okay to ask her. I heard one of the best quotes I've ever actually heard, and subsequently it was not said by a great world leader or anything like that. It's not something you're going to find, I don't think you will at least, by a Google search or anything like that. But I'll let Dr. Finley add that part, who it was said by and what the actual quote was, because it kind of shows, well, I'll let her say it.
So we were in class and we were talking about what does peace really mean, and clearly peace is something that it's important to me. And so I did this little trivia quiz of famous peacemakers, and the last one was the bonus question, and the quote was, "I wish everyone was nice and not sad and teach peace." And of course, nobody really knew who that was because she's about to be a famous peacemaker, and that's my 7-year-old daughter, Anya. And I thank Danny for letting me publicize her words. But the message is what we really wanted to resonate today is that peace comes through our understanding, and hopefully we've gained some understanding and we've gained some chances to at least dialogue. And so again, we thank you very much. If you could please help us fill out an evaluation if you don't have to run, we'd appreciate it to get some feedback. And again, if the panelists are able, we'd love to have you approach them individually.